folks. Welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I'm Anthony, your host. I wanted to start this morning by saying a few words about a secondary reason I have for doing this podcast. Obviously, the primary reason is to bring the great work being done by my colleagues in the field of Byzantine studies to your attention. I found that the podcast medium is a great way of getting that work across, better than learned academic monographs, which have a very small circulation. Very few people read them or have the time to read them or the access to read them. Same for scholarly articles. But this has turned out to be a way by which thousands of you can see what's going on in the latest research. Setting that aside, I have a secondary kind of personal reason for doing it. Well, lots of reasons, but one of which is that ever since college or grad school especially, I have I don't know if worry is the right word or anxiety about the ability of human beings to actually communicate. And I mean that in a very specific way. That is the ability of one person to develop a complex thought, like an insight or an argument, that is falsifiable. So not a truism or a tautology or something that's obvious to everybody, but something that you have to work at and that can be falsified, and to communicate it effectively to other people such that they are all at least talking about the same thing, if not necessarily agreeing about it. This is obviously an essential precondition for any scholarship actually happening, but while I was in grad school, I realized that this doesn't always happen, and in fact, it was an alarming number of times when it didn't happen. So for example, I would read a book review after having read the book, and I found that the book review just was describing a different book. Like, that's not the book that I read. And so there was a failure of communication at some point. And presumably the author of the review just simply didn't understand the book, at least the way I did, and was responding to a different book that no one had actually written. And this actually happens also at conferences and in academic discussions when you just see two people talking at cross purposes. Like, they simply can't connect and come to an agreement about what it is that they're talking about. I don't mean for them to agree. That's not what I'm looking for. I don't believe that there can be some sort of universal consensus about anything, or that there should be. But there should be agreement about what exactly it is that we're agreeing or disagreeing. As I said, this happens remarkably often in scholarly discussions, enough to cause me some alarm or underlying anxiety about whether we're clicking or connecting. And I found that the podcast medium is great for reinforcing my belief that human beings can actually communicate. Like, I read this thing and I understood it in the way in which you intended me to understand it. And I am now conveying that back to you and asking you to explain it to many, many more people who are going to be listening in. And we're doing so in a way that the essential ideas of work of scholarship are getting across successfully. And I think that's great. By the way, if we want to get deeper into it, so I am getting older, and I've noticed in some of my older colleagues there's a tendency to start operating by some kind of mental filing system, which is extensive. So after decades of experience, they've accumulated many, many, many mental files. And if you say a word, a name, a person, a concept, an event, they go to that mental file, they open it up, and they find they have all these resources in there. The problem is that after a certain number of years, those mental files kind of become fixed. They become fixtures, and they don't add more files. And so you start having cross-purpose discussions because you say Aristotle, and they go into their mental file and they pull out the thing on, it could be Aristotle, it could be philosophy, or it could be paideia. And it's like, whatever's in there, that's what the discussion is going to be about. So for example, it might be Aristotle equals higher education equals a class signifier that one is educated. And that's the discussion is always taken there. It's like, no, I'm here to talk about like Aristotle's ideas of ethics, the actual ideas, and how this text might be reflecting them. No, it's all about performance of elite status. It's like, no, we're not communicating. So I don't want that to happen to me, and so I'm making a point of I'm forcing myself to try to understand the ideas of scholars in a wide range of disciplines, subdisciplines, and to understand them in the way in which they intended them, and not to kind of force them into the cubbyholes that are obviously beginning to form in my mind too. So there, enough about that. I meant that not merely in an autobiographical way, but as a warning to us all. Okay, so let's get to work. A number of episodes of this podcast have been about what we might call the life cycle of an ordinary person, insofar as we can access that in the Eastern Roman Empire. And we've talked about infancy and childhood, and in the past we've talked about what we can tell about people's lives from their skeletal remains, and many other topics of either about daily life or the various transitions from one phase to another. And we have a number of more episodes like that coming up. But I thought it would be fascinating to include in this loose cycle, I haven't given it a name or anything, but something about the non-human world and the life cycle of non-human life forms. This type of research would be very difficult to carry out just a few decades ago, but now with the accumulation of scientific data and sophisticated methods for processing it and bringing it into alignment with what the texts say, we are beginning to get some fascinating ecological histories of antiquity in the Middle Ages and of Byzantium in particular. One of the most fascinating books along these lines that I've read recently is by Alexander Olson, which is called Environment and Society in Byzantium from 650 to 1150. The subtitle is Between the Oak and the Olive, and it is a ecological and historical history of those two species, especially the olive. I found it quite fascinating. I had never realized that there had been such a huge variation in the extent to which these trees were cultivated and used in the different periods of Byzantine history. And yeah, it all came to light. And Alex writes very, very clearly. So going back to what I said previously about effective communication, and it's all the more difficult to communicate the life experiences of a tree because no tree has ever told us what that is. And so it has to be reconstructed in very particular ways. We talk a little bit about what the sources are and the great sort of overhaul that happened in the agricultural regimen of Byzantine life in the provinces and in the kind of forests that were around people and so forth, and how they used them and how they engaged with them. This is a fascinating read. So I don't want to make this intro any longer. Thanks to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes. And without any further delay, here's my discussion with Alex. Alex, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So there's a saying among astronomers that God put most astronomers in the northern hemisphere of the planet, and most of the stars are visible from the southern hemisphere. And I sometimes feel that there's something similar going on with like Mediterranean or Aegean history, where most of the people who write about it in antiquity, in the Middle Ages or so on, live in a completely different ecology from the one that they're studying, right? So this landscape that you describe, the olive trees and oak trees and all of that, the particular versions of them that you find in Greece and Western Asia Minor, right? I sometimes wonder if some of my colleagues have a purely academic understanding of what an olive tree is. And when I teach courses in like history, sort of general, whatever, I will start on the first day. Often I'll just be showing them like, this is an olive tree, this is a fig tree, this is a goat, just so that they know what these things look like. Anyway, that's
Yeah.
for students. All right. So I want to start with the olive tree, which is probably the protagonist of your book. And I love the fact that the protagonists of your book were trees. So most listeners will assume that the olive tree is just a permanent fixture of the Aegean landscape, and that the economy and, dietary habits of people in Greece and Western Asia Minor always, revolve around the olive tree. But before we talk about its decline in the Middle Byzantine period, tell us a couple of things. First, how extensive was the cultivation of olive trees in earlier Roman times? And can you give us a sense, that is, of the industrial scale of production here, and what were olive products used for?
Okay. So in the say, for lack of a better term, we'll just call it the classical Roman period, first, second, third centuries. It appears that it was olive cultivation occurred on a grand scale. There's a fantastic archaeologist, David Mattingly. He wrote extensively on this topic, and I remember reading some of his articles and just being struck by his argument was so compelling, and he talked about the scale of olive cultivation in what's now North Africa during the Roman period, but Roman North Africa, and also Spain, Italy, and pointing out that you had not only did olive cultivation require a certain degree of technical know-how and investment, with these large olive presses that could churn out huge volumes of olive oil, but it also was an industry that had subsidiary components. So you needed a ton of people now to make the amphorae, the ceramics that you're gonna ship the olive oil in. You needed people to load this onto ships. You needed people to take it to big consumption centers like Rome, where you're going to distribute it to the populace, or to other big cities for that matter. So you have people using the olive oil to make other products. He was pointing out that they used it to make, moisturizers. They used it to make perfumes. They used it as a fuel for lamps rather than just a condiment for food. You're also using it in the baths, for example. It's part of the bathing culture. It's something you use to moisturize your skin. So it's this product that it's turned into many different things and used for many different purposes. And because it's used for so much, it ends up blanketing a lot of the landscape in certain parts of the Roman world. You have olive trees growing in just huge numbers in some places. And this continues into late antiquity. And you even get references to it in, say, the Levant, where you have enterprising farmers who have planted hundreds of the trees in their lifetime in an effort to make more profit from all these olives. So I guess to answer your question really briefly, the olive was very widely cultivated in the Roman world, the classical Roman world, not the medieval, but classical Roman world,
Right.
really broadly cultivated and used for lots of different purposes.
And because of that, and I think many people put that together with the prevalence of the olive tree in those lands today. Like on my island, Lesbos, I'm told there are like 16 million of them.
Yeah,
that's a number we're told. I don't know if that's possible, but
that's a big number. I mean, Lesbos is a big island, but that sounds like a very big number.
It does.
I don't want to challenge it.
No, I don't know. But you kind of assume that it's been that way all along. And your book makes a very careful and nuanced argument about that was not the case all along. But we'll get to that in a moment. After the industrial scale, let's also talk a little bit about the kind of labor involved. So what are the practicalities of the cultivation of olive trees and, in order to get the product? So I assume that most people don't know this. At least most people listening to the podcast here haven't actually been personally part of the olive tree cultivation process. So what does that look like?
Well, the actual process of making the oil, we'll start with the process of the tree. Generally, you have to graft the tree onto a stalk in where you're going to make it grow. You have to graft the tree there. You have to protect it when it's young, make sure that nothing comes along and damages it while it's growing. You have to make sure it gets enough water. It doesn't need a lot of water compared to most other crops, but it still needs some. It's not the perfect, drought resistant plant. It's drought resistant, but it needs some water. After you are very patient, it takes at least 5 years really to get any fruit from it that's worth anything.
Right.
But that's early. Some trees you got to wait 20 years before you can get really good crops, and it only fruits every other year. And even that every other year when it fruits, it sometimes has a very meager harvest. So it's not a perfect crop, let's say. But the actual labor requirement as you're trying to make the olive tree able to produce fruit, it's mostly pruning, making sure nothing gets to it, giving it enough water. Once it's producing fruit, I think that's where we're more into the human involvement part of the discussion. And that is, you need to gather the olives. That can happen from hitting the tree with sticks and making the olives fall down. It can be as simple as just picking up the olives that have fallen if you wait long enough, or you can pick them by hand. This is all before mechanization, obviously, right. But in say the Byzantine context or the ancient Greek context, these are the ways you can gather the olives. Once you've gathered them, you got to put them in baskets. You got to take them to a crusher. And the crusher can vary considerably. It can be as simple as people just literally beating these olives with a block until you've crushed them, to, at the other end of the spectrum, a very sophisticated crusher that's made out of a volcanic rock and has a moving part that will roll and crush the olives into a paste. Mm-hmm. Regardless of how you do it, once you're done crushing, you have this paste. And then you take this paste, usually in sacks, and you take it to a press. So remember the first time I learned about it, that was an important distinction. Crushing, pressing, two different things. So the pressing part is where you're basically leaving the olives for an extended period of time with a weight on top of them to get the oil out. And then the oil ends up usually in a big vat. And you have to let that sit so that the oil will separate from the water and then the other sludge. So it sort of becomes like a parfait, 3 layers, right? Oil, water, and sludge at the bottom. And then you ladle the oil off the top typically, and put it into whatever receptacle you're going to store it in. So I guess in a nutshell, that's sort of the human labor component, what people have to do to get the oil from this fruit.
Right. And walking around archaeological sites or the remains of settlements in this part of the world, you will often come across the remains of crushers. They're either these big stone wheels or the stone platforms that they rolled on in order to crush it's a pretty common thing to see. It's a very big, bulky stone device, and they tend to survive. Okay, good. So your book makes the argument that this kind of industrial scale of olive oil production basically ceased in the Middle Byzantine period. So between the 7th and the 11th or 12th centuries, right, depending on the region.
Yeah. My argument is that it pretty much stops in the 7th century and only exists on very small scales in particular locales, and in other locales it just disappears entirely, and then it comes back around the late 10th, early 11th century, but not on the same scale.
Okay, so before we talk about why this happened, can you tell us how we know that this happened? So what is our proxy data or direct data that leads you to this conclusion?
The biggest type of data that led me to the conclusion was what's called fossil pollen. There's people who work on assessing the types of pollen from different plants that exist in, say, a bog or a lake bed. They extract it in a core, and then they do what's called a stratigraphical analysis, where they look at the layers and they try to find something with which you can date the layer, And then they literally under a microscope count the types of pollen, and they publish these pollen reports, and they say, hey, this is fascinating. Back in 800 in this particular place in a marsh outside of Athens, we can see that there was some vine, pollen from Vitis vinifera, the vine was present. We can see some cereal was present. Here's a list of grasses that were present. And oh, lo and behold, not a lot of olive present. And I noticed that in several of these reports where the olive in the layers that we would call the Middle Byzantine period, the medieval Roman period, there's not a lot of olive. And you see that in site after site after site. And some of them there are exceptions where you'll still have some, but it doesn't look like it's anywhere near the presence that they had beforehand. So that one type of data alone, the fossil pollen, that one form of data alone really made me think, okay, there's not a lot of olive trees pollinating in the countryside around the Aegean during this period of time. And from there, then I started looking elsewhere. Textual sources, they're pretty, they don't tell us much about the olive. No. Archaeology. Yeah, we have crushers from the period, but they're being used for watering troughs and are being put in churches, right? So once you start expanding from the pollen, you find that, yeah, there's just not a lot there to indicate olive olé culture on a great scale.
So why do you think this decline happened?
I think that this decline happened for a multitude of reasons. One of them, I would say, I think olé culture really likes security. The ancient Roman period certainly was more secure when it came to facilitating trade than, say, the 7th century. You have this road network that's being maintained. The Mediterranean Sea was relatively devoid of pirates for most of the ancient Roman period. So it's easy to move bulk products from A to B, comparatively speaking. And there's markets for it in these great big consumption centers like Rome. So A, it's possible to move the product. It's secure enough to move it. B, right. There's this demand in these big consumption centers. And I think C, there is a incentive insofar as you have to pay your rents, you have to pay your taxes. You go back to that wonderful argument that Hopkins made for the 1st and 2nd centuries in Rome. He had this wonderful argument about taxes and rents sort of stimulating the economy under the Roman rule. And I think there's a lot to be said for that argument. The idea is, hey, the tax collector comes around now. The landlord comes around. You owe money. How are you going to get money in a world with an agrarian economy? You produce agrarian products like olive oil, for example. So it's possible to move the olive oil, make money. There's an incentive to move it for money because you need to pay your bills. And there's a demand for olive oil because of the various cultural practices and the dietary preferences at the time. So I think all those make this perfect storm for having olive oil in that period. But when you get to the 7th century, that's all gone. It's not a very secure time if you're in the Aegean basin. It's not a time where if you're afraid of raiders showing up or some sort of violence, you have to be able to move. You have to be able to get out of your home and go somewhere else. Take livestock with you, for example. That doesn't make olé culture as attractive, I think.
Right.
I also think the incentive is gone because the markets just aren't as big in, say, the 800, 900 in Byzantium. You've got Constantinople, but I think that's pretty much it. I don't think there's much demand for olive oil at the time.
Yeah, so it's not just the security of the cultivation, which is one factor, but it's the security of the trade routes and the size of the demand, right, in the markets that would fuel, extensive industrial production. And all of those decline together.
Exactly. And pretty much all that's gone after 650, and therefore, why bother cultivating olives? So I guess that's sort of the argument.
Yeah. So what kind of products do people use in the place of, olive products?
I think dairy is a big one. You can use butter. You don't have to have olive oil. You can use butter, right? I prefer olive oil personally, and But I know of people who are the opposite. Um, but I think that dairy probably edged it out in many ways. Also, yeah, you can use olive oil to light a lamp, but if you want, you can also use a candle to light space at nighttime. Well, it looks like there was plenty of wax still available. Um, I think that things like wax and dairy products sort of displace the olive when the oil is not readily available anymore.
Yeah, and in fact, archaeologically, there's an argument that the ancient style of lamps goes out of fashion or just isn't manufactured anymore after the 7th century, and they switch to candles.
Yeah.
Right, which is eventually how you end up with people with the name Curularius, which yes, is just a wax candle maker. Yeah, there are a number of changes in sort of material culture at this time. Some of which are relatively neutral, like from lamps to candles. They still produce the same kind of light, and their advantages and disadvantages to their use. But the transition from something like a tiled roof to a thatched roof is a really diminution of quality of life there. But anyway, okay. So what happens to the olive trees themselves? So you have a landscape that's full of olive trees, and all these factors kick in, and people just aren't safe or interested or incentivized enough to cultivate them. What happens to the population?
Yeah. Well, the term that another prof told me, Benjamin Graham, and I think he's in Memphis now. He was saying that they go feral. I love that term, so I use it in the book. But I
got a kick out of that.
I wish it was my word, but I'm giving it to him. But yeah, they go feral because if you're not pruning them, then the leaves just take over the tree. You also get new shoots coming up, and it starts to look like a bush, not a tree. And not enough sunlight can get in to make fruit grow. It's just leaves are now absorbing all the sunlight, and that's why you have to prune the tree if you want it to be productive agriculturally speaking. Yeah. So I think you end up with all these bushes all over the countryside, these former olive groves, and they're just not great for producing fruit.
Yeah, I'm imagining a landscape with millions of feral olive trees. Anyway, so once that happens to a tree, does that mean like it can't go back, or like you can't bring it back under cultivation? Does it mean that it that doesn't reproduce as well? And so like if this continues for a couple of centuries, like does the landscape does it result in a landscape with fewer trees in it? What happens?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I know from individually, the individual trees will not pollinate much. They basically stop bearing fruit and they stop pollinating much. So that goes a long way also to explaining the absence of olive pollen in the cores. But I think that over time, they don't reproduce as much, and they maybe get edged out by competitors. There are certain other species, I believe, that they do grow often within abandoned olive groves. I think pistachia is one of them. I'm a little hazy on that actually, but I think pistachia was one of them. I think lentisks might be another. So there are other species that would probably start to invade the abandoned groves. And then, the trees, they do die eventually. But mind you, olive trees can live a very long time.
Yeah.
In both wild and domesticated form. And to get back to your other question, you can essentially re-domesticate it. You can go back and prune that tree. It's a lot of work, but you can actually bring it back to being a tree for cultivating olives.
Yeah. Actually, why don't you give us a sense of the lifespan of a cultivated olive tree, like maximum?
Oh, I mean, I've heard that they can be, in the well over 1,000 years. There are examples of that. I think the record somewhere was something like 2,000. I don't recall off the top of my head, but I've heard there's one in Crete that's like 2,000 years old. I've heard stories. I don't actually know off the top of my head what the average is. I'm sure there's a lot of variation depending on exposure, relief, soil. But yeah, hundreds of years is completely normal. There's nothing unusual about 500, 600, 700 years at all.
Yeah, 2000 is the highest number that I've heard, and I think it might have been about Crete. Yeah. But 600 to 700 is like no sweat. We can do that. And we should say that there's a lot of variation among different kinds of sort of subspecies of olive trees, and they look very different and feel like I'm used to the varieties in Greece and on Lesbos, but when I went to Andalusia for the first time, I was really struck by how small they are. I was like, what are these trees? You call them olive trees, and I was reminded there's a saying about like forests on Iceland, which is like, if you ever get lost in a forest on Iceland, you just stand up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah,
there are these tiny little olive trees. I'm like, what are you? Anyway, so cute. All right. So your book also makes a complex argument for when and why the olive tree returned to cultivation in like the later Middle Byzantine period. How did that happen?
Well, I think it returns. That's my argument. My argument is that if you look at some of the proxy data again, the fossil pollen, there are some locations where it starts to increase again around 1000, depending where you are and on the dating of the individual core. But there's a few of them. There's a few cores where, a few case studies, if you will, where we see the signature of olive pollen start to increase again. We also can see in the archaeological record in some places that there's new workshops being built. For example, in Sparti, new workshop built. There's an olive crusher in it. I believe in Asia Minor and Aphrodisias, they had one too in the 9th century, but that's sort of outside of my geographical area. But you do see in the 10th, 11th centuries, some archaeology indicating olive cultivation again. And then last but not least, we have texts talking about it. Athenite monastic texts are talking about it. We have some monasteries in Asia Minor that are talking about it. And some of these involve peasant renters being tasked with maintaining and cultivating a grove, and they owe a payment of rent in oil, and the rest they can ostensibly sell for a profit. And finally, actually, we do have Italian merchants who have left us documentation demonstrating they were picking up, some pretty impressive volumes of olive oil from places like Laconia, and then shipping that to Constantinople, or perhaps even shipping it further into the southeast, to the Levant, to Cairo. So there is documentation to indicate that this trade was resuming, for lack of a better term. Why? I think the reason why it returns is it's once again kind of like in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries. You have enough peace in the Aegean basin, or at least enough security to facilitate the movement of this product. There's incentive again, once again, because of the tax collector has come back, so to speak, as well as the monastic landlords or lay landlords. We don't know enough about them in Byzantium, but I don't know why they wouldn't have been doing it too, especially given that they probably owned a lot more land than any monasteries did. But I guess that's a different conversation. And then last but not least, there's a demand for them for things like both for food purposes. It seems to be a condiment, using olive oil for almost like a relish, I suppose. But also for lighting. We're hearing a lot about lamps again. Lamps in these big monasteries and big churches in Constantinople. Sometimes there's even a specific differentiation between candles and lamps, and you're using both. So all told, I think once again, there's an incentive, there's demand, and then the environment is secure enough to facilitate the movement of the product.
Yeah, this seems to be one of those cases where the presence of the Italian trade networks stimulated production in the interior of, East Roman lands. Because, there's this traditional narrative that the trade concessions of the Italians meant that they took over all of the trade, and so led to sort of economic stagnation. But in part, they seem to have played a stimulating role.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we also forget that, it's not like Genoese and Venetians just showed up and took over all trade all over the Mediterranean. You still had
Right.
Eastern Roman traders who dominated the Black Sea trade, or who were even going to Italy. There were people sailing from what's now Constantinople to Ancona and up the Adriatic. Like you said, it's the narrative is pretty complicated, and by and large, it looks like there was economic growth, whatever the concessions were for
Yeah.
the Genoese.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other trees that you discuss in the book, specifically oak and chestnut. So what are their uses, and to what degree are the labor practices that they require different?
For the uses of oak and chestnut, I think it's safe to say that both of them, once again, provide nutrition for humans. Chestnuts directly so, because you can eat the chestnut, but acorns indirectly so. And same with leaf litter. Some of the leaf litter from oaks in particular, they indirectly provide the nutrition for humans via animals. So sheep and goats, for example, can eat the leaf fodder. Pigs can eat acorns, and then we humans convert that in the form of meat or dairy products. So in a roundabout way, they do feed us. Other uses would include wood, both for construction but also for fuel. I'm not too familiar with people using chestnut for fuel. More for wood, for say ship planks or construction. But oak is definitely used for charcoal, and there is reference to that. And oak is certainly used for building, and then also tannins, which you need to work things like animal hides into leather. You get the tannins from the acorn caps, so they once again provide many different products, and people can interact with those products for textiles, building, food, but many different ways that they can make use of them. Yeah.
And so what factors influence the cultivation of deciduous oak and chestnut in the places that you study? So in the 10th or 11th century, so you identify a number of those factors.
Yeah, and I for chestnut, for example, I was really inspired by Paolo Squittridi's work on chestnuts in early medieval Italy, and I just remember reading that book. It was just like, I thought it was just an incredible book. I love it, but I couldn't find anything quite like that in Byzantium with respect to people cultivating chestnut trees. Sorry, I didn't see a lot of that. I see them making use of them, but I'm not hearing much about like making entire groves of them. It seemed more like you got a chestnut tree here, it's yours. You want to make sure everyone knows it's yours. It was more, it seemed more reactive in a way, people really making use of their natural environment, and laying claim to it, rather than saying I'm gonna plant 12 trees here. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that one of the reasons why chestnut seems to do well in a couple of locales in the 10th and 11th century is that while people are clearing other things, while they're clearing other spaces to grow grain or to set up a vineyard, you don't get rid of the chestnut tree. That seems to be what I found. With deciduous oak, it's similar. Deciduous oak is something that there is a reference, I think, if my memory serves me correctly, from the 13th century in Western Asia Minor, which falls after the period where my book ends,
Sure.
where there actually is a deliberately planted oakery. There's a space where they've deliberately planted them, like as if it was apple trees or olive trees. Now, I don't have evidence of that in, say, the 10th, 11th centuries in the Aegean Basin, but what I would say is that deciduous oak has a real capability in that part of the world to take over abandoned farmland. It's very good at that. And my hypothesis is just that you get a lot of abandoned farmland in the 7th century, and deciduous oak is able to colonize a lot of that land, and humans are not going to get rid of it unless they absolutely need to. They make use of it. and they leave it there. And that's what I think happens. So it's not a matter of them cultivating it so much as saying, we're going to leave this untouched because it's really useful to us and we're going to work with it.
Actually, now that you're saying it that way, you might actually explain a very strange thing that I encountered way back in the day when I was doing like archaeological survey on Lesbos. So I was kind of tracking late antique, early Christian Byzantine remains, of which there are very, very many. And by remains, I mean even like settlement remains, like little piles of construction material from, whenever. And so walking through the fields and the hills and all of that, eventually I realized that the aprinos tree is the easiest way to identify where there are remains. They're usually like growing directly on top of them. And you'll have a landscape that's all these, olive trees, and it's a grove, and it's, tended and all that. And there'll be a prinos tree right on or next to the remains of some early Christian basilica. I had no idea what it was between the prinos and the archaeology remains, like what is going on. But now, it's possible that like everything around it was cleared away when the olive groves were planted, but they just left those because they're not going to disrupt the remains of the ancient chapel, and they just kind of leave whatever's there, which includes those trees. All right.
That makes sense. And Prinos in particular, the evergreen oak is just, it's a monster for taking over whatever it wants. I mean, it's hard to get rid of, and it can hang on to anything.
It can, and it's really unpleasant. I mean, it made working on those sites, just measuring stuff, anyway, okay, enough. So monks and monasteries come up a lot in your book, obviously, because much of our data comes from the few, monastic archives that we have. Tell us some ways in which they participated in these processes in kind of interesting or idiosyncratic ways, like things you wouldn't have expected, like certain things that monasteries might have used oil for and the like.
Yeah, I found that, I guess I should say it didn't surprise me, but the monasteries were interesting in that they do create they create their own agro ecosystems, for lack of a better term. They create lots of they clear land, they clear rocks, they clear trees, and they create cultivated farmland essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And they engage in some really impressive surplus agriculture. And they also, while they're at it, get wonderful tax exemptions to make it even more profitable to engage in surplus agriculture. So, they really are into, vertical integration, so to speak, in economic terms, right? And I think that if there's anything surprising that monasteries were involved in vis-a-vis olay culture, I would say it was just the need for lamp fuel. I mean, you need so much lamp fuel when you have particularly these big monastic churches in Constantinople that need to be constantly illuminated, and then further illuminated during special events. They had a real need for olive oil, and that would have certainly driven them to support olay culture. Beyond that, I'm trying to think about more idiosyncratic things. I did find it very interesting, actually, the role their archives played in alerting me to something else, and that was this idea of clearance. The idea that you're clearing woodland, and how, whenever they're talking about boundary markers, trees are just so important to them. I don't think we think a lot about that aspect of it. The fact that they've always got monks, and sometimes it's even a hermit monk who lives on his own, who's just like, no, that's my chestnut tree, and then that triple trunk tree has that sign carved into it, and there's that old one there, and there's that young one there, and those are the boundaries. And it was like, that was actually what really struck me, was the idea that the world these guys lived in, out in around Mount Athos, or even elsewhere for that matter, some of the monasteries you read about in Western Asia Minor, where it's not like a symbolic landscape, to me at least. And this might just be my own very I don't know, sort of simplistic way of viewing the world, but it wasn't like a rich symbolism. It was very, very physical, very corporeal, very,
Yeah.
these are the boundaries of who owns what, and it's that physical object there, that one there, that one there. And I think that's what actually really struck me from looking at the monastic sources more than anything. Yeah.
Yeah, that also, it sounds familiar from walking over the fields and so forth of the island, when I would encounter locals and ask them, about the locales and directions. It was always in terms of very specific trees, rocks, and things like this. And then it was an effort to struggle to understand which tree or which rock they actually meant, and go
Right.
left after that one. And
Right. Exactly. And that really does sort of hammer home the point that to other people, these symbols are just, they're so ingrained in your sense
yeah,
of space, and you don't think twice about it. But if you're from, say, another particular type of environment, you grow up in this city or that city, this is all lost on you. I mean, you just you don't have the conceptual framework to differentiate between these symbols. It all looks the same, right? So yeah, and I guess that really did stand out to me. Yeah, for sure.
yes, the funniest answer I ever got was, so I was looking for some ancient shrine that a local antiquarian had cataloged them in a particular area, and had said there's one of Saint so and so over by some hill in next to that. It's hard to find. And I found a local, and I asked him, "Hey, where's this shrine to Saint so and so?" Oh, yes, I know that. And he pointed at the road, and he says, "Well, you take this, and then you go left, and then right, and then left, and then it turns this way, and it goes that way, and you turn left and right." And it was a bit baffling because there was like only one road, and there were no other roads. It didn't, there was nowhere to turn, until I realized after a while that he had simply just described every single turn and twist in that one road between where we were and the place that, anyway, that was great.
So at the end of the road was the long and the short of it. Just go to the end of the road.
Yes, yeah. All right. I appreciate that in some key moments of your argument, you bring in the role of the state. So now we'll move away from farmers and fields and so on, and talk about Constantinople and the polity as a whole. And you make the argument that state policies were actually important and influential in having like immediate environmental impact, as well as social and economic. Could you talk a little bit about this link between policy and sort of economic landscape impact? Like, where do you see it?
Yeah, I see two main things. One of them is the direct impact, and that is when you resettle people. When the state decides we're going to move this many people from, say, Armenia or maybe central Anatolia, we're going to move them to a place in what's now Greece. That's a big deal. I mean, if you're moving 2,000 people or 500 soldiers and their families, they're going to need to eat something, right? They're going to need to clear land. They're going to, or other people in the locality that are moving to are going to have to clear land. So that's a direct impact, and it's going to change the environment in that locale. I think the other thing is more indirect, but it gets back to the fiscal policies. When the state is demanding coins and taxes, once again, to get back to the Hopkins argument, people are going to have to grow something to pay those taxes. And that means indirectly the state is leading to people clearing land or growing a certain type of crop versus another, in the interest of obtaining coins with which they can pay for their bills. And I guess another thing that maybe I didn't think about enough, but which also makes sense, is people want to buy their way into obtaining some sort of a title with a pension, or simply networking. Something that's maybe less coercive, more actually self seeking one's own advancement, one's own promotion. Well, you're going to need to make money for that too, and that's going to also require you to most of the time make money off of agricultural products. So I think that that's not really a state policy, but I think that's actually maybe something else that needs to be said, is just the existence of a state machinery, the fact that it exists, and that there are there are people that you need to meet to advance your career, and that you need to be able to pay for things. That too, I think, has an impact on the environment.
Yeah, I remember in the 8th century, Constantine V, so he began to insist more on payment of taxes in cash rather than in kind. And of course, because he was a supposedly iconoclast and the sources that we have about him are hostile, this is presented in very negative terms. But in reality, he was basically requiring people to sell their surplus on the market and pay him in cash, which of course stimulates market, production to market. And he also issued more coins. He put more coins into circulation so that this was possible. And anyway, yeah, that also has environmental impact. But anyway, so in the book, you also engage in some interesting mathematical calculations I found fascinating. Can you give us an example of one? Like, what's your favorite math problem in the book?
Well, I'm not actually very good at math. I took a refresher a couple of years ago after I wrote the dissertation for the book. So I guess my math was not as bad as I had thought. I got actually a very good grade in it, which surprised me. I was very surprised. But no, the book has some math problems. They're pretty simple arithmetic. It was just, hey, if hypothetically a lamp burns this much olive oil for this many hours of illumination, let's take a look at some of these monastic typica, and you got a typicon for this monastery that says we need this many lamps burning this many hours, or on special occasions, and we need this many lamps burning all the time, and we need this many lamps burning at night. And you start just adding up, okay, how many lamps are burning, how many hours do you think? Because we don't know for sure all the hours, but if let's just be really conservative, say it's 8 hours of darkness. Okay, I'm being really conservative there. Multiply the 8 by the number they want burning at night, and then add that to the number they want burning all day. And then they ask for more during Vespers and some of the other religious celebrations. And you start adding this all up, and then you multiply it by the number of, or you divide it by the number of hours you can get from, say, 1 liter of olive oil. And then you arrive at this big number of liters that you still have left over. There's a lot of liters of olive oil required just to illuminate all this. And then you think to yourself, okay, well, that math problem actually taught me something about the demand that these monks had for olive oil just for lighting purposes. So yeah, that was the one problem I dealt with in a couple of instances, which was, I thought, illustrative.
When you're dealing with high volume of materials and logistical problems, I often wonder how they themselves dealt with these issues. Like, was the steward of the monastery like really good at math? You'd calculate the volumes required. I mean, they would have had to be. I don't think it could all have been empirical. There are, a couple of mathematical exercise books. I know one in Greek and one in Armenian that have related problems like this. Like the Armenian one, I think, is something about the salaries of the priests of Hagia Sophia. If it's something like, if each priest gets this many nomismata and the total budget is X, how many priests work in Hagia Sophia? Is this stuff like that? I can't recall now anything about liters of oil, but yeah, this must have been definitely an issue, especially since the churches in the capital and a lot of these Ivy League monasteries, they had endowments of land, part of whose purpose was to provide them with these kinds of materials. And so Hagia Sophia, think how many olive groves, right, are dedicated to providing Hagia Sophia with the oil that it needs. Like, we don't think about that very much, but your book made me think about it, so that was good. So speaking of things that your book can make people think about, come to the end here. Any final thoughts about working on environment and society in a Byzantine or just a pre-modern context? So what kinds of things should historians be on the lookout for? I mean, historians who traditionally don't engage with these kinds of problems, like we normally think of history as being the history of people and not the history of trees, for example. But I found it fascinating. You kind of wrote a history of trees, and anyway, there are not many books like that in our field. So, any advice that you have to other historians working on this or any related topic?
Yeah, it's a really good question because I've wondered about that question on and off actually. Even when I was trying to come up with my own PhD, like just a prospectus for the dissertation, and I had taken an environmental history course with a bunch of modernists.
Mm-hmm.
And I strongly believe that it's always a good idea to at least do the mental exercise of thinking what other sub-disciplines are doing that relate to your own research. So let's say you work with texts, studying what people are doing with material conditions might not seem immediately useful, right? It might not seem that way. But I think that if someone just takes even just a little bit of time to familiarize themselves with, say, something that archaeologists are doing that pertains to your field, or art historians, or environmental history, if you want, I think it's still at least it'll make you more creative in your research questions, at the very least. I think I know interdisciplinarity is sort of a word that gets thrown around a lot now. And I think a lot of people, they say they're doing it, but they're not really. Or they're doing it, but they're actually having a hard time drawing meaningful conclusions from it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but that said, I still think it's a really good idea to try to check out the ways that other people are approaching different problems in the time and period that you're studying. Specifically for people who are looking at Byzantine material and are studying, the medieval Roman Empire and the world in which it existed. I think the environmental data is really useful if you want to look at material culture, and it's really useful if you want to look at economy, because the texts are often not telling us enough about that, right? And that's not a value judgment on the texts. I don't want to come off as if I'm insulting medieval Roman authors for not talking about this, because to be frank, most of us in our own context don't know where our food comes from, right? We don't know where it comes from. We don't think about where our own we use cell phones and computers all day. How many of us actually know where the metals come from, right? We're all equally ignorant and focused on our own lives and our own professions and whatnot. And I don't think it's actually reasonable to expect too many of the medieval Roman authors to be any different than us. But the truth of the matter is, they didn't write much that we will find immediately useful if we want to understand how their economy worked. They didn't write much that we will immediately find useful if we want to know what their countryside looked like. And I think that looking at the environmental data really helps add better understanding of, population. Doesn't look like there were as many people around, actually, given what the countryside looked like. What people were eating, how what were people building out of? Were homes generally more of a temporary construction? Like, these are all very interesting things that add nuance to our understanding of the medieval Roman world. So I think the environmental data is really useful from that perspective. And I also think it's really useful, even if a person is studying text, say, it can throw out some really neat things. Like, they talk about rhetoric in texts when they're describing the countryside. I mean, it's a rhetorical technique in a lot of the writing from both the medieval Roman period and all the way back to ancient Greece. During the time of Pausanias and Plutarch, where people are describing the countryside as abandoned. Well, why are they doing that? There's a rhetorical purpose, right? They want to say that there's not a lot of people around. The polis that you're talking about is politically insignificant and weak because there's not a lot of people. Well, if we actually look at this archaeology, or if we look at the environmental data, we might know that there's actually maybe more people around than they're letting on. It basically then will get us thinking, why are they saying this? Well, there's a rhetorical purpose to saying it. What's that rhetorical purpose? So my answer there is that in a roundabout way, being at least conversant with some of this other data can even help you do something like understand the text you're working on, if that makes sense.
It does, and I second everything that you've said. I mean, it's just very good advice. Pay attention to other subfields or disciplines that might seem adjacent, but if you explore them, they will provide essential methodologies, and be on the lookout for blind spots in our sources. It's because they're not talking about anything doesn't mean it never existed.
Yeah.
And there's some pretty major parts of medieval life that they don't really talk about that much, and not because they don't know about it. Often it's the stuff that they know the most. So what's the point of writing it down? Everybody knows that stuff.
Exactly. Like I don't know how many kilometers it is from my apartment to downtown. If you ask me how far it is, I'd say it's 20 minutes by bus, because
yes,
I know the route. I don't need to flesh it all out for you. I'm not going to write it down in a journal or something. It's obvious to me.
Or how tasty a goat is.
Yeah, I don't know if it is very actually. But yeah, I know.
You watch those fighting words.
Anyway. I've had some. It's pretty good actually.
All right, Alex, thank you so much, both for undertaking the research, writing a very clear book about it. I enjoyed reading it, and for coming on to talk to us about it.
Well, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. You take care.